The sound of galloping horses echoed across the Texas prairie like thunder before a storm. Martha Clearwater pressed her infant son closer to her chest, his tiny fists clutching at her worn cotton dress as she peered through the gap in the wooden shutters. Outside, dust clouds rose from the approaching riders, their blue uniforms stark against the golden grassland that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. "They've come for him," whispered her sister-in-law, Sarah Clearwater, her voice barely audible above the baby's soft whimpering. "Just like they said they would." Martha's hands trembled as she traced her finger along her son's perfect features, the bronze skin that marked him as half Comanche, half white, the dark eyes that would forever mark him as different in a world that demanded conformity. At 6 months old, little Daniel had no understanding of the forces that sought to tear him from the only family he had ever known, Mrs. Clearwater. The commanding voice of Captain James Morrison cut through the morning air like a blade. "We know you're in there. Open this door in the name of the United States Army." But Martha Clearwater was no longer listening to the soldiers outside. Her attention was fixed on the massive figure emerging from the tree line behind the approaching cavalry, a man so tall. He seemed to dwarf his horse, riding with the easy confidence of someone who owned everything the eye could see. Jackson Big Jake Patterson, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, whose land stretched from the Red River to the Oklahoma border. What Martha didn't know, what no one in Clearwater Creek could have predicted, was that this giant of a man was about to make a decision that would change the course of all their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1875, and the Texas frontier was a place where 3 worlds collided with the force of competing storms. The remnants of Comanche bands struggled to maintain their way of life on ever-shrinking reservations. White settlers pushed westward with dreams of land and prosperity, carrying with them the prejudices and fears of a nation still healing from civil war. And caught between these forces were the mixed-blood families, people who belonged fully to neither world, yet were shaped by both. Martha Clearwater had never intended to find herself at the center of such a collision. Born Martha Williams in a small Missouri town, she had married young to escape the poverty that had claimed both her parents before she turned 18. Her husband, Robert Clearwater, had promised her a new life in Texas, where land was cheap and opportunities abundant for those willing to work hard and ask few questions about their neighbors' past. What Robert hadn't told her, what she only discovered after they had built their small cabin on the banks of Clearwater Creek, was that his first wife had been Comanche. White Dove, as she was known among her people, had died giving birth to Robert's first son, leaving behind not just a grieving husband, but a complex web of relationships that connected the Clearwater family to the Comanche bands that still roamed the territory. When Robert himself died 3 years later, kicked by a horse while breaking broncos for neighboring ranchers, Martha found herself the sole guardian of his 8-year-old son, Thomas, whose Comanche features made him a target for suspicion in the growing settlement of Clearwater Creek. She also inherited Robert's complicated legacy, his debts, his reputation as an Indian lover, and his connections to people the U.S. Army considered enemies of the state. Martha might have managed to navigate these challenges alone, might have found a way to blend into the community and raise Thomas as just another frontier child, if not for the arrival of Running Bear's band in the winter of 1874. Running Bear was White Dove's brother, a war chief whose reputation for both courage and cunning had made him a legend among the Comanche and a wanted man among the cavalry units tasked with forcing all remaining Indians onto reservations. When his small band, consisting mostly of women, children, and elders, arrived at Martha's cabin seeking shelter from a brutal blizzard, she faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could turn them away, protecting herself and Thomas from association with hostiles, or she could honor her husband's memory and his connections to White Dove's people, offering sanctuary to those who had nowhere else to go. Martha chose compassion over safety. What followed was the most remarkable winter of her life. Running Bear's band, 5 women, 3 elderly men, and 7 children, transformed Martha's small homestead into something resembling a village. The women, led by Running Bear's wife, Singing Bird, taught Martha skills she had never imagined needing: how to preserve meat in ways that would last through the hardest months, how to create medicines from prairie plants, how to read weather patterns and animal behavior to predict changes that could mean the difference between life and death. In return, Martha shared what she had learned about surviving as a white woman on the frontier, how to deal with merchants and government officials, how to navigate the legal systems that governed property ownership, how to present herself in ways that would minimize conflict with suspicious neighbors. But more than practical knowledge was exchanged during those long winter months. Martha discovered that White Dove's sisters, for 3 of the women, were indeed her late husband's first wife's siblings, had stories to tell about Robert that filled in gaps in her understanding of the man she had married. They spoke of his respect for Comanche ways, his efforts to serve as a bridge between worlds, and his deep love for both his wives in ways that honored rather than diminished either relationship. Most importantly, they helped Martha understand her stepson Thomas in ways she never could have managed alone. The boy, who had always seemed caught between identities, began to flourish under the guidance of his mother's people. He learned to speak Comanche fluently, participated in ceremonies that connected him to his heritage, and developed a sense of pride in his mixed ancestry that transformed his entire demeanor. As winter gave way to spring, Martha faced another impossible choice. Running Bear's band could not remain on her land indefinitely without attracting the attention of cavalry patrols that were intensifying their efforts to round up all remaining free Indians. But sending them away felt like a betrayal of everything the winter had taught her about the meaning of family and community. The decision was made for her on a warm April morning when scouts reported that a large cavalry unit was approaching from the east, clearly intent on searching every homestead in the area. Running Bear gathered his people quickly, preparing to disappear back into the vast prairie that had sheltered them for generations. But Singing Bird approached Martha with a request that would haunt both women for months to come. "My sister," she said, using the Comanche words that had become natural between them, "I am with child, and the journey ahead will be dangerous. If something happens to me, will you promise to care for my baby as you have cared for all of us?" Martha had agreed without hesitation, not understanding the full implications of what she was promising. When Singing Bird went into labor 2 months later during another surprise visit to the homestead, Martha served as midwife to the birth of a son whose mixed ancestry would prove even more complicated than Thomas's. The father was not Running Bear, as Martha had assumed, but a white cavalry officer named Captain David Morrison, the same Captain Morrison who had been pursuing Running Bear's band for months, who had been under orders to bring them in dead or alive. The relationship between Singing Bird and Morrison had been brief but genuine, occurring during a period when both were staying near Fort Richardson for different reasons. Now, as Martha held the infant Daniel name for the biblical figure who survived the lion's den, she realized that this child represented something unprecedented, a bridge between 3 worlds, born of love that had transcended the boundaries of race and conflict that defined frontier life. Captain Morrison, when he learned of his son's existence through sources Martha never fully understood, faced his own impossible choice. Military regulations and social conventions demanded that he disavow any relationship with a Comanche woman and her mixed-blood child. But personal honor and growing affection for Singing Bird pushed him toward acknowledgement and protection. The compromise he reached satisfied no one completely, but provided temporary stability for everyone involved. Morrison would provide financial support for the child and ensure that no official action was taken against Martha for harboring fugitive Indians. In return, Singing Bird would remain with Martha rather than rejoining Running Bear's band. And Daniel would be raised as Martha's adopted son rather than acknowledged as Morrison's biological child. This arrangement worked reasonably well through the summer and fall of 1874. Martha's homestead became an unofficial sanctuary where Comanche visitors could find food, shelter, and medical care without fear of betrayal. Morrison made regular visits, ostensibly to check on security conditions in the area, but actually to spend time with Singing Bird and watch his son grow. The fragile peace was shattered in December when Running Bear's band was finally cornered by a different cavalry unit near the Oklahoma border. The battle that followed left Running Bear dead and most of his warriors either killed or captured. The survivors, including several of the women who had spent the previous winter with Martha, were forcibly relocated to a reservation where conditions were harsh and survival uncertain. Word of the battle reached Martha's homestead through the network of mixed-blood families and sympathetic whites that had developed throughout the region. But more devastating than news of the deaths was the information that followed. Captain Morrison had been present during the battle, leading a unit that had participated in the final assault on Running Bear's position. When Morrison appeared at Martha's door 3 days later, Singing Bird met him with a silence that spoke louder than any accusation could have. The man she had trusted, the father of her child, had been instrumental in the destruction of her brother's band and the death of family members she had loved since childhood. "You don't understand," Morrison said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who had discovered that duty and honor could sometimes demand opposite actions. "I tried to arrange for surrender, tried to negotiate terms that would have allowed the band to be relocated peacefully. But Running Bear refused to come in, and my commanding officer ordered the attack." Singing Bird's response was delivered in Comanche, her words carrying a finality that needed no translation. She would no longer remain at the homestead under Morrison's protection. She would take her son and join her surviving relatives on the reservation, preferring the hardships of official captivity to the compromises required by Morrison's well-intentioned but ultimately ineffective protection. Martha found herself caught between loyalty to the woman who had become like a sister and practical concern for the welfare of infant Daniel. Life on the reservation would be difficult for any child, but for one whose mixed ancestry made him a target for suspicion from both Indian agents and traditional Comanche leaders, it could be dangerous. "Let me keep him," Martha pleaded. "At least until conditions improve. I can raise him here with Thomas, give him the kind of life Robert would have wanted for any child in our family." The debate that followed lasted through the night and involved not just Martha and Singing Bird, but also the 4 other Comanche women who had remained in the area despite the increased military pressure. These women, Singing Bird's sisters-in-law and cousins, had their own children to consider, their own impossible choices to make about how to preserve their families and culture in a world that seemed determined to destroy both. By morning, they had reached a decision that satisfied no one, but seemed to offer the best chance for Daniel's survival and happiness. Martha would keep the baby, raising him as her own son alongside Thomas. Singing Bird would join her relatives on the reservation, but would visit whenever possible, maintaining her connection to Daniel while allowing him to grow up in the relative safety of Martha's homestead. Captain Morrison, recognizing that his involvement had made the situation untenable for everyone, agreed to transfer to a post in Arizona Territory. Before leaving, he made arrangements for regular financial support to be sent to Martha through intermediaries, ensuring that Daniel's upbringing would not place an undue burden on her modest resources. For 6 months, this arrangement provided the stability that everyone had hoped for. Daniel thrived under Martha's care, growing into a healthy, happy baby who showed signs of the intelligence and curiosity that characterized both his parents. Thomas embraced his role as big brother with enthusiasm, teaching Daniel the games and songs he had learned from his own mother's people. Singing Bird made 3 visits to the homestead, each time staying for several weeks and helping Martha understand the cultural traditions she wanted Daniel to learn as he grew older. The other Comanche women also visited occasionally, creating a network of aunties and cousins that gave Daniel connections to his heritage that might otherwise have been lost. But the peace Martha had worked so hard to create was built on foundations that were shifting beneath her feet. The U.S. government was implementing new policies designed to completely eliminate Indian identity and culture, policies that would eventually target not just reservation Indians, but anyone suspected of maintaining connections to traditional ways of life. The first sign of trouble came in February 1875, when a new Indian agent was appointed to oversee the reservation where Singing Bird and her relatives were living. Agent Harrison Whitmore was a man whose career had been built on his reputation for efficiently managing Indian populations through methods that emphasized punishment over cooperation. Within weeks of his arrival, Whitmore had implemented policies that made it nearly impossible for reservation Indians to leave the designated area for any reason. Family visits, traditional hunting expeditions, and religious ceremonies that required travel to sacred sites were all prohibited, under threat of imprisonment or reduced food rations. More ominously, Whitmore began investigating the backgrounds of all mixed-blood children on the reservation, looking for cases where tribal enrollment might be challenged, or where children might be separated from their families for placement in government boarding schools designed to kill the Indian. Save the man. When word of these investigations reached Martha through the network of families that had helped her survive the previous year, she realized that Daniel's existence represented not just a personal challenge, but a potential political crisis. A mixed-blood child living off the reservation with a white adoptive mother could be seen as evidence that government policies were not being effectively enforced. Worse, Daniel's connection to Captain Morrison, a relationship that had been carefully concealed but was known to several people, could be used by Whitmore's superiors as evidence of corruption or inappropriate fraternization between military personnel and Indian populations. The crisis that Martha had been dreading finally arrived on a cold March morning when Agent Whitmore himself appeared at her homestead, accompanied by 2 cavalry officers and a clerk whose job was to document any violations of federal Indian policy they might discover. "Mrs. Clearwater," Whitmore announced without preamble, "I have reports that you are harboring an Indian child who should be enrolled on the reservation and attending the government school established for his education and cultural improvement." Martha had known this moment would come, had rehearsed her response dozens of times, but standing in her doorway with Daniel sleeping peacefully in her arms, she found herself struggling to find words that might somehow bridge the gap between law and love, between policy and the practical realities of raising a child in a world that refused to acknowledge his right to exist. "Daniel is my adopted son," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have papers documenting his legal status, and he has been living here since birth." Whitmore's thin smile suggested that he had anticipated this response and found it inadequate. "Mrs. Clearwater, federal law is very clear about the status of Indian children. They belong on reservations where they can receive proper education and guidance. Your personal attachment to this child, while perhaps well-intentioned, cannot supersede the government's responsibility for his welfare." As Whitmore spoke, Martha became aware of movement in the tree line beyond her fields. At first, she thought, it might be cattle from one of the neighboring ranches, but as the figures became clearer, she realized that 5 Comanche women were approaching her homestead, Singing Bird and the 4 relatives who had remained in the area despite the increased risk of capture. What Martha didn't yet understand was that these women had been tracking Whitmore's movements for days, waiting for an opportunity to make one final appeal for the safety of the children they loved. And what none of them could have predicted was that their plea would be heard by a man whose own sense of justice had been shaped by experiences that prepared him to understand the difference between law and right. Jackson Patterson had been riding his eastern boundary when he spotted the unusual gathering at the Clearwater homestead. At 6 feet 8 inches tall and weighing nearly 300 pounds, Big Jake Patterson was a figure of legend throughout the region, a man whose size was matched only by his reputation for fairness and his willingness to stand up to anyone, regardless of their official authority. When he believed an injustice was being committed, what the approaching confrontation would reveal was that Patterson's sense of justice had been shaped by his own experiences with loss, separation, and the arbitrary cruelty of systems that claimed to act in the best interests of those they were actually destroying. The giant rancher who seemed to own half of Texas was about to discover something worth more than all his land and cattle combined, the chance to prevent a tragedy that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jackson Patterson had learned about injustice the hard way, by watching it destroy the people he loved most. As he guided his massive stallion, Thunder, toward the commotion at the Clearwater homestead, memories flooded back with the clarity that only comes when the past suddenly becomes relevant to the present. 15 years earlier, Jake had been a different man entirely. Fresh out of the Union Army after serving under General Sherman, he had returned to his family's modest farm in Georgia with dreams of rebuilding what the war had torn apart. At 25, he was already imposing in stature, but his gentle nature and quick smile made him beloved in the small community where he had grown up. That community included the Cherokee families who had somehow avoided the forced removals of the 1830s, living quietly on marginal land that white settlers had initially considered worthless. Among those families were the Ridges' James Ridge, his wife Mary, and their 3 children, including a daughter named Sarah, who had been Jake's closest friend since childhood. Sarah Ridge was everything Jake was not: petite where he was massive, quick-tempered to his calm, brilliant with words where he relied on actions. She was also, by the racial standards of post-war Georgia, completely off-limits as a romantic partner for a white man with political ambitions. But love, Jake had discovered, paid no attention to social conventions or legal restrictions. Their secret courtship had lasted 2 years, conducted in hidden corners of the forest where Jake's family had once hunted and Sarah's people had held ceremonies before the government decided such gatherings were threats to public order. They had planned to marry and move west, to some territory where mixed marriages were tolerated, and a man's worth was measured by his character rather than his ancestry. Those plans had been destroyed by the same kind of bureaucrat who now stood in Martha Clearwater's doorway, demanding the surrender of a child in the name of government policy. In Sarah's case, the official had been State Inspector William Hancock, whose job was to identify and relocate any remaining Cherokee families to the official reservation in Oklahoma Territory. Hancock had arrived in their county with federal marshals and a list of names that included everyone Jake cared about. But unlike Agent Whitmore, who at least maintained the pretense of acting in the children's best interests, Hancock had been refreshingly honest about his motivations. The Cherokee families owned land that white speculators wanted, and removing them was simply a matter of economic efficiency. "You people have had 40 years to integrate into civilized society," Hancock had announced at a community meeting that Jake had attended, despite knowing his presence might make things worse for the Cherokee families. "The fact that you've chosen to maintain separate customs and traditions proves that you're incapable of true assimilation. The government has been patient, but patience has its limits." Sarah had stood up in that meeting, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been educated in the white schools and knew how to use their own language against them. "Inspector Hancock, every family you're targeting owns their land legally, pays their taxes promptly, and has contributed to this community for generations. What law, exactly, are we violating by continuing to exist?" The question had been perfect legally sound, morally unassailable, and completely irrelevant to Hancock's purposes. Miss Ridge, the law I'm enforcing is the law of practicality. This county needs to move forward, not backward. Your people represent the past, and the past has no place in America's future. Jake had wanted to speak up then, to point out the circular logic and naked prejudice underlying Hancock's position. But Sarah had caught his eye and shaken her head slightly, understanding better than he did that a white man's defense might actually make things worse for her family. Cherokee families had been given 30 days to sell their property and report to the relocation center that had been established at the county seat. Any family that failed to comply would be forcibly removed, and their property would be seized and sold at public auction to cover the costs of their transportation. 20-8 families had complied with the order. James Ridge and his family had been among the 2 that refused. Jake had been at the Ridge homestead on the morning when Hancock returned with federal marshals to enforce the relocation order. He had hidden in the forest at Sarah's insistence, watching through binoculars as officials loaded furniture onto wagons and herded the Ridge children toward a military transport that would carry them to a place they had never seen, to live among people they had never met. Sarah had fought them every step of the way, not with violence but with words that cut deeper than any weapon. She had quoted laws they were violating, treaties they were breaking, constitutional principles they were ignoring. Her arguments were perfect, her logic unassailable, and completely useless against men who had already decided that might made right. The last thing Jake had seen was Sarah being lifted bodily into the transport wagon, her voice still carrying across the clearing as she shouted legal precedents and moral arguments that no one in authority cared to hear. She had looked directly at his hiding place in those final moments, and Jake had read a message in her eyes that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Don't try to follow. Don't try to fix this. Remember us, but don't destroy yourself trying to save us. Jake had honored her wish, but barely. For months after the Ridge family disappeared into the bureaucratic maze of federal relocation programs, he had written letters to every government office he could identify, demanding information about their whereabouts and challenging the legality of their removal. The responses, when they came at all, were form letters expressing confidence that the relocated families were receiving excellent care and were adjusting well to their new circumstances. It had taken Jake 2 years and most of his family's savings to track down what had actually happened to the Ridge family. James Ridge had died of pneumonia during his first winter in Oklahoma, weakened by the stress of relocation and the inadequate shelter provided by the government. Mary Ridge had died 6 months later, reportedly of a fever, though witnesses suggested that grief and despair had been the actual causes. The 3 children had been separated and placed in different boarding schools, designed to eliminate their Cherokee identity and prepare them for assimilation into white society. The youngest, a boy named Thomas, had died in the school infirmary after contracting tuberculosis. The middle child, a girl named Anna, had run away from her school and disappeared entirely. Some reports suggested she had made it back to Cherokee communities, others that she had died attempting the journey. Sarah, the oldest and most educated, had also attempted to escape from her boarding school. She had been recaptured and punished with solitary confinement in conditions so harsh that they had broken her spirit entirely. When Jake finally located her in 1863, she was in a government hospital in Kansas, catatonic and unresponsive to any attempts at communication. Jake had tried to arrange for Sarah's release into his custody, claiming to be her cousin and offering to provide for her care. But hospital officials had refused, explaining that Sarah was a ward of the state and that mixing her with family members would only reinforce the primitive behaviors they were trying to eliminate. Sarah Ridge had died in that hospital 6 months later, never having spoken another word after her recapture. She was buried in an unmarked grave alongside dozens of other former boarding school students who had died far from their families and communities. By the time Jake learned of Sarah's death, He had already begun the process that would eventually make him one of the largest landowners in Texas. Using his military connections and the compensation he had received for his war service, he had purchased vast tracts of frontier land at prices that reflected their danger and isolation. He had built his fortune through a combination of cattle ranching, land speculation, and contracts to supply beef to military posts throughout the territory. But wealth had been a means rather than an end for Jake Patterson. Every acre he acquired, every dollar he accumulated, every relationship he built with politicians and military officers was motivated by a single purpose: ensuring that he would never again be powerless to protect people he cared about from the arbitrary cruelty of government bureaucrats. The transformation had required Jake to become something he had never intended to be: ruthless in business, intimidating in negotiations, willing to use his size and reputation to get what he wanted. The gentle giant who had once charmed neighbors with his kindness had evolved into Big Jake Patterson, a man whose name was spoken with respect and fear throughout the region. But the core of who Jake was, the man who had loved Sarah, rich enough to fight an unwinnable battle for her freedom, had never changed. It had simply been buried beneath layers of wealth and power, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. That moment had arrived as Jake approached the Clearwater homestead and saw 5 Comanche women walking deliberately toward a confrontation with federal officials, who had the power to destroy their lives with the stroke of a pen. The scene was so similar to what had happened to the Ridge family that Jake felt 15 years of carefully controlled rage suddenly surge to the surface. But this time, he was not a powerless young farmer watching from the forest. This time, he owned more land than some eastern states, employed more men than most military units, and had relationships with politicians who needed his support more than he needed their approval. This time, he might actually be able to make a difference. As Jake rode closer to the homestead, he could see the tableau forming with the clarity of impending disaster. Agent Whitmore and his escorts stood near the front porch, official documents in hand, representing the full authority of the federal government. Martha Clearwater stood in her doorway, baby Daniel in her arms, representing the love and determination of a mother protecting her child. And approaching from the east, walking with the dignity of people who had already lost everything else, but refused to surrender their principles, were the 5 Comanche women who had come to make one final plea for a child they considered family. Jake recognized the moment for what it was: not just a bureaucratic procedure, but a collision between 2 completely different understandings of justice, family, and human worth. On one side stood the law, backed by military force and centuries of precedent that gave white officials absolute authority over the lives of Indian families. On the other side stood love, backed by nothing more than the fierce determination of women who refused to accept that government policy could override moral obligation. Jake had seen this same collision destroy the Ridge family, had watched helplessly as good people were crushed by a system that measured humanity in terms of racial categories and political usefulness. But 15 years of building wealth and power had been preparation for exactly this moment: the chance to stand between injustice and its victims with enough force to actually change the outcome. As Thunder's hooves touched the edge of Martha's property, Jake made a decision that would define not just his own future, but the lives of everyone gathered at the small homestead. He would not stand by and watch another family be destroyed by bureaucrats who confused legal authority with moral legitimacy. The war that had been building for months between love and law, between family bonds and government policy, was about to have an unexpected participant. And for the first time in 15 years, Jake Patterson felt something he had thought was lost forever: hope that justice might actually be possible in a world that seemed designed to reward cruelty and punish compassion. Agent Whitmore looked up as the massive figure on horseback approached, his expression shifting from bureaucratic confidence to something approaching concern. He had dealt with plenty of frontier resistance to federal policy, but never from someone whose physical presence suggested that persuasion might not be sufficient to ensure compliance. Jake dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled, letting his full height and bulk register with everyone present before he spoke. When his boots hit the ground, the sound seemed to echo across the prairie like a challenge issued to the forces that had gathered to tear a family apart. "Gentlemen," Jake said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I believe you're on my land." It wasn't true Martha's homestead was legally independent, owned through a combination of her late husband's claim and her own hard work. But Jake's statement served notice that whatever happened here would involve him personally, and that Agent Whitmore's routine bureaucratic procedure had just become significantly more complicated. The 5 Comanche women had stopped their approach. When Jake appeared, uncertain whether this massive white man represented additional threat or unexpected salvation. But Martha Clearwater, holding her baby son closer to her chest, felt a flutter of hope for the first time since Whitmore's arrival. Big Jake Patterson had a reputation throughout the territory, not just for wealth and power, but for fairness and protection of those he considered worthy of his support. If he was willing to involve himself in Daniel's case, the outcome might be very different than what Agent Whitmore had anticipated. That the confrontation that would determine a child's future was about to begin, and for the first time, the forces of love and family had a champion whose resources matched his determination to see justice done. Agent Harrison Whitmore had built his career on the principle that displays of federal authority were most effective when they were swift, decisive, and brooked no interference from local interests. In his 12 years of managing Indian affairs, he had learned that hesitation invited resistance, and resistance could quickly spiral into the kind of public relations disasters that ended careers in Washington. But as he looked up at the towering figure of Jackson Patterson, Whitmore felt his carefully rehearsed confidence wavering for the first time in years. This was not some frontier farmer who could be intimidated with threats of federal prosecution, nor some local sheriff who depended on government contracts to maintain his authority. This was a man whose wealth and political connections might actually rival those of the bureaucrats who had sent Whitmore to Texas. "Mr. Patterson," Whitmore said, forcing his voice to remain steady, "I'm not aware that you have any legal interest in this property. Mrs. Clearwater's homestead is clearly delineated in the county records, and my authority here derives from federal mandate, not local property rights." Jake's response was a slow smile that never reached his eyes. "Agent Whitmore, I'm not talking about legal technicalities. I'm talking about practical realities. This entire valley depends on water rights that flow through my land. The roads that brought you here cross my property at 6 different points. The supplies that keep Clearwater Creek functioning come through contracts that I negotiate and guarantee." He gestured broadly at the landscape surrounding them. "In short, sir, while you may have federal authority over Indian affairs, I have something more immediate: the power to make your life very difficult if you insist on pursuing a course of action that I consider unjust." The threat was delivered with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather, but its implications were clear to everyone present. Jake Patterson had the resources to tie up federal operations in this region with legal challenges, supply disruptions, and political pressure that could make Agent Whitmore's position untenable. Whitmore's 2 cavalry escorts, Lieutenant Charles Bradford and Sergeant Robert Hayes, shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. They had been briefed to expect possible resistance from the Comanche women or local sympathizers, but no one had prepared them for dealing with a man whose economic power might actually outweigh their military authority. "Sir," Lieutenant Bradford interjected, with respect, "federal law supersedes local interests in matters of Indian policy. Agent Whitmore has legal authority to remove this child, and we're here to ensure that authority is respected." Jake turned, his attention to the young officer, studying him with the kind of assessment that made seasoned negotiators nervous. "Lieutenant, How long have you been stationed in Texas? 6 months, sir. And in that time, how many successful operations have you conducted that required cooperation from local ranchers, merchants, or transport companies? Bradford's silence was answer enough. Jake nodded with satisfaction. What you're discovering, Lieutenant, is that federal authority only works when it's backed by practical support from people like me. Out here, hundreds of miles from the nearest federal courthouse, your authority depends on local cooperation. He gestured toward Agent Whitmore. Your superior here wants to remove a child from a loving home, based on racial classifications that have nothing to do with the boy's welfare. I'm suggesting that such an action would be both morally wrong and practically difficult to implement without my assistance. Singing Bird had been watching this exchange with the intensity of a woman whose child's future hung in the balance. As Jake spoke, she began to understand that this massive white man might actually possess the power to challenge the federal officials who had seemed untouchable. But she also recognized that his intervention would mean nothing unless he understood what was really at stake. Moving with the dignity that had made her a respected voice among her people, Singing Bird stepped forward and addressed Jake directly. In accented but clear English, Mr. Patterson, I am Singing Bird of the Comanche people. The child you see in Martha's arms is my son Daniel. I ask you to listen before you make your decision about helping us. Jake's expression softened as he looked at the woman whose courage reminded him painfully of Sarah Ridge. Ma'am, I'm listening. My son's father is a white man, a soldier who loved me and tried to protect our child. But the world we live in has no place for children who belong to two peoples. The government wants to take Daniel to their school, where they will try to kill everything in him that comes from me and my people. Singing Bird's voice remained steady, but Jake could see the pain beneath her controlled exterior. Martha Clearwater has been a mother to Daniel since his birth. She has fed him, protected him, loved him as her own. The other women here are his aunts, his grandmothers, and our way of counting family. We are not trying to keep him from learning the white man's ways. We want him to know both worlds, to be strong in both. Agent Whitmore interrupted impatiently. Mrs. Singing Bird, the government school will provide your son with education, discipline, and opportunities for advancement that he cannot receive in this irregular household. You're being selfish by keeping him from those advantages. The response came not from Singing Bird, but from one of her companions, an elderly woman whose weathered face spoke of decades of surviving on the harsh frontier. She spoke in Comanche, her words carrying the authority of age and experience. Singing Bird translated for Jake's benefit. My aunt, wise woman, says that she has seen what happens to our children in the government schools. They come back as strangers, ashamed of their families, unable to live in either world. She asks if you know what became of the Cherokee children who were taken from their families 20 years ago. Jake's face went white at the reference. The parallel between Daniel's situation and what had happened to Sarah Ridge's family was so exact that it felt like a message from the past. I know exactly what happened to those children, he said quietly, and I'll be damned if I let it happen again. Agent Whitmore recognized that the conversation was moving beyond his control, but his training and temperament pushed him toward escalation rather than negotiation. Mr. Patterson, I don't know what personal experiences have influenced your opinion, but federal law is clear about the status of Indian children. This child belongs on a reservation where he can receive proper guidance, and if I refuse to allow you to take him, Whitmore's smile was thin and cold. Then you'll be interfering with federal officers in the performance of their duties. That's a felony, Mr. Patterson, regardless of your wealth or local influence. The threat hung in the air between them like a challenge. Jake had spent 15 years building his fortune and reputation precisely to avoid being intimidated by men like Whitmore, but he also understood that direct confrontation with federal authority could have consequences that extended far beyond his personal interests. It was Martha Clearwater who broke the stalemate. stepping down from her porch with Daniel in her arms and approaching the group of officials with the determination of a mother protecting her child. "Agent Whitmore," she said, "before you take my son, I want you to answer one question. Have you ever held a baby?" The question was so unexpected that Whitmore blinked in surprise. What does that have to do with anything?" "Have you ever held a baby?" Martha repeated. "Have you ever gotten up in the middle of the night to comfort a sick child? Have you ever watched a little one take his first steps or said his first word?" Whitmore's discomfort was obvious. "Mrs. Clearwater, my personal experiences are not relevant to this legal matter." "They're the only thing that's relevant," Martha replied firmly. She moved closer, holding Daniel so that Whitmore could see the baby's face clearly. "This is not a legal matter, Agent Whitmore. This is a child. A real, living, breathing little boy who knows my voice, who reaches for me when he's scared, who smiles when I sing to him." Daniel, as if responding to his mother's words, reached out toward Whitmore with the trusting curiosity of a 6-month-old who had never learned to fear strangers. The gesture was so innocent, so completely without guile, that even the bureaucrat seemed momentarily affected. "Look at him," Martha continued. "Really look at him. He's not a policy problem or a racial classification. He's a baby who needs love, stability, and people who care about him as an individual. Can your government, school provide that?" For the first time since his arrival, Agent Whitmore seemed genuinely uncertain. The abstract principles that governed Indian policy were easy to defend in Washington offices, but they became more complicated when applied to actual children with specific needs and relationships. It was this moment of hesitation that Singing Bird's companions chose to make their own appeal. The 4 women stepped forward in unison, arranging themselves in a semicircle around Martha and Daniel. Each one spoke in turn, their words translated by Singing Bird for the benefit of the white officials. "Little Fox says that Daniel carries the spirit of her brother, who died fighting for our people's freedom. She asks that he not be denied the chance to honor that spirit. Dancing Moon says that she helped deliver Daniel into this world, and that she will not live to see him raised without knowledge of his mother's people. Buffalo Woman says that the white schools teach children to be ashamed of their Indian blood, but Daniel should be proud of both sides of his heritage. Morning Star says that she has lost 3 children to the white man's diseases, and she begs that this one be allowed to grow up with people who will love him." The cumulative effect of these individual pleas was powerful, but it was Singing Bird's own final words that carried the most weight. "Mr. Patterson, Agent Whitmore, all of you, we are not asking you to break your laws or ignore your duties. We are asking you to see our child as a human being, rather than a problem to be solved." She moved to stand beside Martha, the 2 mothers united in their determination to protect Daniel. "If you take him to the government school, you will be separating him not just from Martha, who has been his mother since birth, but from all of us who love him. You will be teaching him that love is less important than law, that family is less valuable than policy." Jake Patterson had been listening to this exchange with growing emotion, remembering his own helplessness 15 years earlier, when similar arguments had been made on behalf of the Ridge family. But this time, he had the power to actually make a difference. "Agent Whitmore," Jake said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a decision-maker, "I'm going to make you an offer that I suggest you consider very carefully." Whitmore straightened, recognizing that whatever came next would determine not just the immediate outcome, but his own future effectiveness in the region. "I'm listening, Mr. Patterson. I propose a compromise that serves everyone's interests. Daniel remains with Martha Clearwater, who has legal custody and has proven her ability to provide excellent care. But I personally guarantee that he will receive education equivalent to what any white child in Texas could expect, including instruction in both English and Comanche languages and customs." Jake's offer was gaining momentum as he spoke the details, crystallizing in his mind. Furthermore, I will establish a trust fund that ensures Daniel's future educational opportunities, including university if he chooses, with no cost to the federal government. And I will personally monitor his welfare to ensure that he develops into a productive citizen who brings credit to both sides of his heritage. The proposal was generous almost to the point of absurdity, but Jake understood that sometimes overwhelming generosity was the most effective form of pressure. By offering to personally guarantee Daniel's welfare and education, he was making it almost impossible for Whitmore to argue that government intervention was necessary for the child's benefit. Agent Whitmore found himself in an impossible position. Jake's offer addressed every practical concern about Daniel's welfare while completely undermining the ideological justifications for forced removal. More importantly, rejecting such a generous proposal would make Whitmore appear petty and vindictive rather than concerned with the child's best interests. "Mr. Patterson," Whitmore said slowly, "your offer is generous, but federal policy exists for reasons that go beyond individual cases. If I make exceptions based on personal wealth or local influence, the entire system becomes meaningless." Jake's response revealed the steel beneath his diplomatic offer. "Agent Whitmore, your system has already proven its meaninglessness by creating situations where loving families are destroyed in the name of helping children. What I'm offering is a chance for your system to actually accomplish its stated goals, instead of simply perpetuating cruelty." The confrontation had reached its crucial moment. Agent Whitmore had to choose between inflexible adherence to policy and acceptance of a solution that served everyone's practical interests. The 5 Comanche women waited in silence, their plea hanging in the air like a prayer. Martha held Daniel closer, preparing for either salvation or the beginning of a fight that would define the rest of their lives. And Jake Patterson stood ready to use every resource at his disposal to ensure that this time, love and justice would triumph over bureaucratic indifference and racial prejudice. The giant rancher who had failed to save Sarah Ridge 15 years earlier was about to discover whether wealth and power could succeed where love alone had failed. Agent Harrison Whitmore had climbed the bureaucratic ladder by understanding one fundamental truth. In government service, careers were made or broken based on a single principle: never give your superiors reason to question your judgment. Every decision, every report, every action had to be defensible within the framework of established policy, regardless of individual circumstances or personal feelings. But as he stood in Martha Clearwater's yard, surrounded by Comanche women whose dignity challenged every assumption he had made about Indian character, and facing a rancher whose wealth could make his life professionally impossible, Whitmore found himself confronting a situation that defied the neat categories of his training. The silence stretched for nearly a full minute as Whitmore weighed his options. Lieutenant Bradford and Sergeant Hayes watched their superior with growing concern, recognizing that whatever decision came next would have consequences far beyond this single homestead. The 5 Comanche women stood motionless, their faces revealing nothing of the desperate hope that burned beneath their composed exteriors. Martha shifted Daniel to her other arm, the baby's weight a constant reminder of what was at stake. The child had begun to fuss slightly, perhaps sensing the tension that surrounded him, and Martha automatically began the gentle swaying motion that always calmed him. The simple, maternal gesture was so natural, so obviously born of countless repetitions, that it spoke more eloquently than any argument about who had truly raised this child. Jake Patterson remained perfectly still, his massive frame radiating the controlled power of a man who had learned to achieve his goals through patience rather than force. But beneath his calm exterior, 15 years of carefully suppressed rage simmered just below the surface, waiting to be unleashed if Whitmore chose the wrong path. Finally, Agent Whitmore spoke, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man who had decided to prioritize survival over ideology. "Mr. Patterson, your offer is unprecedented, But before I can consider any deviation from standard procedure, I need to understand the exact terms of your proposal." Jake recognized the opening for what it was: not agreement, but negotiation. "The terms are simple, Agent Whitmore. Daniel Clearwater remains in the custody of his legal guardian, Martha Clearwater, who has raised him since birth. I personally guarantee his education, which will include instruction in reading, writing, mathematics, history, and sciences equivalent to any child in Texas." He paused, his gray eyes never leaving Whitmore's face. "Additionally, Daniel will receive instruction in Comanche language and customs from his birth mother and her relatives, ensuring that he grows up with knowledge of both sides of his heritage. I will establish a trust fund of $10,000 to guarantee his future educational opportunities, including university if he chooses to pursue higher learning." The amount was staggering, more than most frontier families would see in a lifetime, more than many government officials earned in a decade. But Jake continued as if discussing pocket change. "Furthermore, I will personally report on Daniel's progress to any federal officials who wish to monitor his development. If at any point the government can demonstrate that he would receive better care and education in a federal facility, I will personally escort him to that facility and cover all associated costs." Agent Whitmore felt his carefully constructed arguments crumbling in the face of Jake's overwhelming generosity. How could he possibly argue that government custody was in Daniel's best interests, when a private citizen was offering educational opportunities that far exceeded anything the federal system could provide? "Mr. Patterson," Whitmore said slowly, "while your offer is generous, there are broader policy considerations at stake. If I make exceptions based on individual circumstances, word will spread throughout the territory. Every mixed-blood family will expect similar treatment, and the entire system of Indian management will become unworkable." It was Singing Bird who responded to this objection, her voice carrying the quiet authority of a woman who had seen enough government policy to understand its true purposes. "Agent Whitmore, you speak of managing our people as if we were cattle to be herded, rather than human beings with the same hopes and fears as your own families." She gestured toward the other Comanche women. "We have watched your government schools take our children and return them as strangers, ashamed of their families and unable to live in either world. We have seen your reservations become prisons where our people die of diseases and despair while waiting for promises that are never kept." Her words gained strength as she continued. "You say that making an exception for Daniel will create precedent that threatens your system. But what if your system deserves to be threatened? What if a system that destroys families in the name of helping children is a system that should not survive?" The challenge was direct and powerful, but it was Martha Clearwater who delivered the argument that cut to the heart of Whitmore's dilemma. "Agent Whitmore, I want you to look at my son and tell me honestly, does he look neglected? Does he look unloved? Does he look like a child who needs to be rescued from his current situation?" Daniel had settled into contentment in his mother's arms, his dark eyes bright with the curiosity of a healthy, well-cared-for baby. His clothes were clean and well-made, his skin was clear and healthy, and his obvious comfort with Martha spoke of a bond that had been built through months of consistent, loving care. "I won't pretend that raising Daniel has been easy," Martha continued. "There have been challenges, questions about his place in a world that doesn't seem to have room for children who bridge different cultures. But those challenges have made our family stronger, not weaker." She looked directly at Whitmore, her voice carrying the passionate conviction of a mother defending her child. "Daniel knows he is loved unconditionally by people who value both sides of his heritage. He will grow up understanding that being different is not something to be ashamed of, but something that makes him uniquely valuable." Lieutenant Bradford, who had been listening to this exchange with growing discomfort, finally spoke up. "Agent Whitmore, sir, perhaps we should consider that our orders were to investigate reports of an improperly placed Indian child. If our investigation shows that the child is receiving excellent care and education, Haven't we fulfilled our mission? The young officer's suggestion offered Whitmore a face-saving way to retreat from an increasingly untenable position. But it also revealed the fundamental weakness in the government's approach to mixed race families, the assumption that bureaucratic categories were more important than individual welfare. Jake Patterson recognized that the moment had come for his final argument, the one that would either secure Daniel's future or force a confrontation that could have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. "Agent Whitmore," Jake said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who held winning cards, "I want to share something with you that might help clarify the choice you're facing." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, from which he extracted several official-looking documents. "These are letters from Senator William Henderson of Texas, Congressman Robert Matthews, and General Philip Sheridan, all expressing their support for my various business and civic endeavors." Jake handed the documents to Whitmore, who scanned them with obvious surprise. The letters were recent, written within the past 6 months, and they established Jake as a man whose opinions carried significant weight with some of the most powerful political and military figures in the region. "Now," Jake continued, "imagine trying to explain to those gentlemen why you rejected a generous offer to provide superior education and care for a child, choosing instead to separate him from a loving family in order to place him in a government facility with a documented history of failure and abuse." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Jake was not just offering his personal resources to resolve Daniel's situation. He was putting his political connections behind the effort, making it clear that opposing him would mean opposing men whose support was crucial to Whitmore's career advancement. But Jake's next words revealed that his motivations went deeper than mere political maneuvering. "Agent Whitmore, 15 years ago, I watched federal officials destroy a Cherokee family based on the same policies you're trying to enforce today. Good people died because bureaucrats decided that racial purity was more important than human decency." His voice hardened with remembered pain. "I was young then, powerless to stop what I knew was wrong. But I'm not powerless anymore, and I'll be damned if I'll stand by and watch another family destroyed by the same twisted logic that killed the woman I loved." The revelation caught everyone by surprise, humanizing Jake's intervention in ways that pure generosity or political pressure could not. This was not a wealthy man showing off his power or buying influence. This was someone who had experienced the same kind of loss that now threatened Martha and Daniel, and who finally had the resources to prevent it from happening again. Agent Whitmore felt the last of his resistance crumble in the face of Jake's passionate honesty. The bureaucrat in him still insisted that exceptions to policy created dangerous precedents, but the human being in him recognized that some situations demanded flexibility rather than rigid adherence to rules that might be fundamentally flawed. "Mr. Patterson," Whitmore said finally, "if I agree to your proposal, I need guarantees that go beyond your personal word. I need documentation that will satisfy my superiors and protect me from charges of negligence or corruption." Jake's smile was the first genuine expression of warmth he had shown since arriving at the homestead. "Agent Whitmore, I'll provide you with more documentation than you know what to do with. Legal custody papers, educational contracts, financial guarantees, character references from every prominent citizen in 3 counties. He gestured toward Martha and the Comanche women. "But more importantly, I'll provide you with something your superiors will find even more convincing results. In 5 years, 10 years, whenever you care to check, Daniel Clearwater will be living proof that children thrive when they're raised with love and respect for their complete heritage, not when they're forced to choose between 2 halves of themselves." The negotiation had reached its conclusion, but it was Singing Bird who provided the final element that sealed the agreement. Moving with the dignity that had impressed everyone present, she approached Agent Whitmore directly and spoke in English that, while accented, carried unmistakable authority. "Agent Whitmore, I want to make you a promise. If you allow my son to remain with Martha, I will ensure that he grows up to be a credit to both his peoples. He will be educated, respectful, and productive. But most importantly, he will remember that there were people in positions of power who chose mercy over rules, who chose to see him as a child rather than a problem. She paused, letting her words sink in. And if you force us to take him from the only mother he has ever known, I promise that you will create an enemy who will spend his entire life working to undo everything your government has tried to accomplish. The choice could not have been clearer. Agent Whitmore could accept Jake's unprecedented offer and allow Daniel to remain with Martha, creating a model that might point toward better ways of handling mixed-race families. Or he could insist on following standard procedure, guaranteeing that a child who might have bridged two worlds would instead become a symbol of government inflexibility and cruelty. "Very well," Whitmore said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who had just made a decision that would define the rest of his career. "Mr. Patterson, I accept your proposal. Daniel Clearwater will remain in the custody of Martha Clearwater, subject to the conditions and guarantees you have outlined." The relief that washed over the assembled group was almost palpable. Martha sank onto her porch steps, holding Daniel close and whispering words of gratitude that were barely audible. The 5 Comanche women embraced each other with the quiet joy of people who had just witnessed a miracle they had not dared to hope for. But it was Jake Patterson who understood most clearly that their victory, while complete, had come at a price that would shape everything that followed. By forcing Agent Whitmore to make an exception to federal policy, they had created a precedent that would attract attention from Washington officials who might not be as flexible or as susceptible to pressure as a frontier bureaucrat trying to avoid controversy. Daniel was safe for now, but his future would depend on Jake's ability to make good on every promise he had made, and on the family's capacity to prove that love and respect could accomplish what force and separation had failed to achieve. The battle for one child's future had been won, but the war between two different visions of America was just beginning. 3 months after Agent Whitmore's departure from the Clearwater homestead, the fragile peace that had settled over the small community was shattered by the arrival of a telegram that would change everything. The message, delivered by a nervous postal clerk who had ridden hard from Clearwater Creek, was addressed to Jackson Patterson and bore the official seal of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. Jake read the telegram twice before its full implications sank in. Commissioner of Indian Affairs Edward Smith was dispatching a special investigative team to Texas, led by Inspector General Marcus Fleming, with orders to review all irregular arrangements involving Indian children in the territory. The investigation had been triggered by Agent Whitmore's report, which, despite his agreement to Jake's proposal, had been required by regulations to document every deviation from standard procedure. What made the situation particularly dangerous was Fleming's reputation. Unlike Whitmore, who had been a career bureaucrat more interested in avoiding trouble than making examples, Fleming was a true believer in the government's assimilation policies. He had built his career on the principle that any compromise with Indian customs or mixed-race arrangements represented a fundamental threat to American civilization. Jake folded the telegram and looked out across his vast ranch, where cattle grazed peacefully under the endless Texas sky. Everything he had built, all the wealth and influence he had accumulated to prevent another tragedy like what had happened to Sarah Ridge, was about to be tested by a man who viewed compassion as weakness and flexibility as betrayal of national duty. But Jake Patterson was no longer the powerless young farmer who had watched from the forest 15 years earlier. He had learned that preventing injustice required more than good intentions. It demanded strategic thinking, careful alliances, and the willingness to fight battles on multiple fronts simultaneously. His first stop was the Clearwater homestead, where he found Martha in the garden with Daniel, who at 9 months old was beginning to show signs of the bright intelligence that characterized both his parents. The baby was sitting up steadily now, reaching for butterflies with the focused determination that made Martha laugh despite her constant worries about his future. "Martha," Jake said gently, not wanting to alarm her unnecessarily, "we need to talk about Daniel's situation. There are developments in Washington that could affect our agreement with Agent Whitmore." Martha's face immediately tensed with the fear that had never completely left her since that confrontation 3 months earlier. "What kind of developments?" Jake explained the telegram and Fleming's reputation, watching as Martha's expression shifted from concern to determination. The months of caring for Daniel while knowing that government officials might return at any time had transformed her from a frightened widow into a fierce protector who would not surrender her child without a fight. "What do we need to do?" she asked simply. "We need to build a coalition that's stronger than one man's wealth and influence," Jake replied. "Fleming won't be impressed by political connections or financial guarantees. He's coming here to prove a point about federal authority, and he'll see any compromise as a sign of weakness to be corrected." Jake's strategy was ambitious and risky, but it represented the only approach that might work against a true believer. Like Fleming, instead of relying on his individual resources, he would mobilize every person and interest group in the region that had a stake in maintaining local control over family matters. The first allies he recruited were unexpected ones. Other mixed-race families scattered throughout the territory who had been watching Daniel's case with desperate interest. These families had been living in constant fear that their own children might be targeted next, and Jake's success in protecting Daniel had given them hope that resistance was possible. Samuel and Rebecca, 2 bears, lived on a small farm 50 miles south of Clearwater Creek with their 3 children, whose mixed Kiowa and white heritage made them potential targets for removal. James and Maria Spotted Horse had built a successful trading post near the Oklahoma border, but their prosperity made them visible to government officials who viewed economically successful mixed-race families as threats to the reservation system. Most importantly, Dr. William and Catherine Longfellow operated a medical practice in the county seat, where Dr. Longfellow's mixed Cherokee ancestry had been overlooked because his medical skills were desperately needed on the frontier. These families represented a cross-section of mixed-race success stories that contradicted everything Fleming believed about the inability of Indians to assimilate into white society. Jake's second group of allies came from the white community itself: ranchers, merchants, and professional men who had benefited from his business relationships and who understood that federal interference in local family matters represented a dangerous precedent that could affect anyone. Judge Thomas Hartwell, whose court had legal jurisdiction over custody matters in the region, was particularly valuable because his support would give any decisions about Daniel's future the weight of established legal authority. Sheriff Robert Connor commanded respect throughout the territory for his fairness in dealing with both white and Indian communities, and his endorsement would carry significant weight with military officials who might be tempted to support Fleming's investigation. Perhaps most importantly, Jake enlisted the support of Reverend Michael O'Sullivan, whose Catholic Church served families from every ethnic background in the region. O'Sullivan's theological arguments about the sanctity of the family unit provided moral authority that balanced Fleming's claims about national policy. But Jake's most crucial alliance was with an unexpected source: Captain David Morrison, Daniel's biological father, who had been following his son's case from his new posting in Arizona Territory. Morrison's guilt over his role in the destruction of Running Bear's band had been eating at him for months, and Jake's telegram, offering him a chance to actively protect his child, provided an opportunity for redemption that the officer desperately needed. Morrison's military connections were extensive, and his reputation for honesty and competence gave him credibility with officers who might otherwise dismiss civilian concerns about Indian policy. More importantly, His personal knowledge of Daniel's parentage provided legal complications that Fleming would have to navigate carefully. The coalition that Jake assembled represented more than just local resistance to federal authority. It was a demonstration that successful integration of mixed-race families was not only possible but beneficial to entire communities. The economic prosperity of the region, the peaceful relations between different ethnic groups, and the obvious success of children like Daniel in thriving within mixed cultural environments all contradicted the assumptions underlying Fleming's mission. But Jake understood that facts and demonstrations would not be sufficient to deter a man like Fleming, who viewed compromise as betrayal and flexibility as weakness. The Inspector General would need to be convinced that pursuing his investigation would cost him more than it would gain, both professionally and personally. Jake's research into Fleming's background revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited if necessary. Fleming had built his career on a series of successful removals of Indian children from mixed families, but several of those cases had resulted in tragedies that had been covered up by supportive superiors. Children who had died in government schools, families that had been destroyed by separations, communities that had been destabilized by the loss of their most successful mixed-race members. All of these consequences had been documented by critics of federal policy, but Fleming had never been held accountable for his role in creating them. More immediately useful was Fleming's political ambition. The Inspector General clearly hoped to use his success in Indian affairs as a stepping stone to higher office, possibly as a territorial governor or federal judge. Such ambitions made him vulnerable to pressure from influential political figures who could either support or oppose his future advancement. Jake's strategy was to present Fleming with two choices. He could conduct a fair and honest investigation that would demonstrate the success of the current arrangement, or he could find himself facing a public controversy that would damage his reputation and destroy his political ambitions. The key to making this strategy work was ensuring that Fleming's visit to Texas would be conducted under maximum public scrutiny. Jake arranged for newspaper reporters from San Antonio, Austin, and even New Orleans to cover the investigation, framing it as a test case for federal versus local authority in family matters. He also invited representatives from churches, civic organizations, and business groups throughout the region to observe Fleming's methods and evaluate his conclusions. The goal was to make it impossible for Fleming to conduct the kind of secretive, one-sided investigation that had characterized his previous work. Most importantly, Jake arranged for several prominent politicians to visit the region during Fleming's investigation, ostensibly for other business, but actually to observe his methods and form their own opinions about the Daniel Clearwater case. These officials included state legislators, federal congressmen, and military officers, whose opinions would carry significant weight in Washington. As word of Fleming's impending arrival spread throughout the region, the investigation began to take on symbolic importance that extended far beyond one child's future. For mixed-race families, it represented a test of whether they had any rights that the federal government was bound to respect. For local communities, it was a question of whether Washington bureaucrats could override local decisions about family welfare. For Jake Patterson, it was his final chance to prove that wealth and power could be used to protect the innocent rather than exploit the vulnerable. Everything he had built since Sarah Ridge's death would be meaningless if he could not save Daniel from the same fate that had destroyed the woman he loved. The stakes were raised even higher when Singing Bird and the other Comanche women announced their intention to remain in the area during Fleming's investigation, despite the obvious risks of exposing themselves to a man who viewed all Indians as enemies of civilization. Their presence would provide powerful testimony about Daniel's cultural heritage and the loving relationships that Fleming's policies would destroy. "We will not hide while our child's future is decided by men who do not know him," Singing Bird declared at a community meeting that Jake had organized to coordinate their response to Fleming's investigation. If Inspector Fleming wants to judge whether Daniel belongs with his family, he must see all of his family. The courage of these women, who were risking their own freedom to protect a child who was only partially their own, inspired the entire community to greater efforts on Daniel's behalf. Families who had previously remained neutral began openly supporting the Clearwater household. Businesses that had been cautious about involving themselves in Indian affairs began contributing resources to the legal defense fund that Jake had established. Most remarkably, several other mixed-race families from throughout the territory began converging on Clearwater Creek, determined to stand together against federal policies that threatened all of their children. What had begun as one family's struggle for survival had evolved into a movement that challenged the fundamental assumptions of American Indian policy. Inspector General Marcus Fleming would arrive in Texas expecting to conduct a routine investigation of a bureaucratic irregularity. Instead, he would find himself facing a coalition of families, communities, and political interests that had united around a simple principle: that love and successful parenting transcended the racial categories that Washington policymakers used to justify separating children from their families. The battle for Daniel's future had become a battle for the soul of American justice, and Jake Patterson had assembled an army of allies who were prepared to fight that battle with every resource at their disposal. The question that remained was whether their combined strength would be sufficient to overcome the power of a federal government that viewed compromise as weakness and flexibility as betrayal. Fleming's train was scheduled to arrive in 2 weeks, and everything that Jake had worked for since Sarah Ridge's death would be decided in the confrontation that followed. Inspector General Marcus Fleming stepped off the train at Clearwater Creek with the confidence of a man who had never failed to complete a mission in 15 years of federal service. At 42, Fleming possessed the lean build and sharp features of someone who lived on principle rather than comfort, and his gray eyes held the unwavering certainty of a true believer who had never encountered a situation that couldn't be resolved through proper application of federal authority. What Fleming saw as he surveyed the small frontier town, however, was not the isolated community he had expected to find. The platform was crowded with more people than a settlement of Clearwater Creek's size should have been able to produce, and many of the faces watching his arrival carried expressions of barely concealed hostility that suggested his reputation had preceded him. Inspector Fleming, a well-dressed man in his 30s, approached with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with government officials. "I'm Robert Henderson, correspondent for the San Antonio Express. I wonder if you might have a few moments to discuss your investigation?" Fleming's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In his previous assignments, he had been able to conduct his work without media attention, relying on the isolation of frontier communities and the powerlessness of mixed-race families to ensure that his methods went unexamined. The presence of newspaper reporters suggested that someone had been preparing for his arrival with uncomfortable thoroughness. "Mr. Henderson," Fleming replied with practiced neutrality, "I'm here to conduct an official investigation into irregularities in the application of federal Indian policy. I'll be happy to provide statements to the press once that investigation is complete." But even as Fleming spoke, he was cataloging details that suggested this assignment would be more complicated than his superiors had indicated. The crowd on the platform included not just curious locals, but several men whose expensive clothing and confident bearing marked them as people of substance and influence. More concerning were the 3 women whose dress and features clearly identified them as Indians, a brazen violation of the understanding that such people should remain on reservations unless specifically authorized to travel. Fleming's escort consisted of 2 federal marshals, Deputy Marshals William Clark and Thomas Jefferson, names that Fleming privately suspected were aliases chosen to irritate government officials. Both men were experienced in handling Indian affairs, but neither had worked in Texas before. and Fleming could see them evaluating the unexpected crowd with professional wariness. "Inspector Fleming," another voice called out, and Fleming turned to see a massive figure approaching through the crowd. Jackson Patterson was even more imposing in person than his reputation had suggested, and the ease with which the crowd parted before him indicated a level of local influence that could complicate federal operations. "Mr. Patterson," Fleming acknowledged. Coolly, "I understand you've taken a personal interest in the case I'm here to investigate." Jake's smile was polite, but carried an undercurrent of warning that reminded Fleming of predators evaluating potential threats. "Inspector, I take a personal interest in justice, regardless of the specific case involved. I trust your investigation will be thorough and fair." The emphasis on fairness was subtle but unmistakable, and Fleming recognized it as notice that his methods would be scrutinized by people with the resources to make their opinions count. In his previous assignments, Fleming had relied on the inability of Indian families to challenge his conclusions or publicize his methods. That advantage was clearly not going to be available in Texas. "Gentlemen, ladies," Fleming addressed the crowd with the authority that had served him well in less prepared communities, "I'm here to conduct official business on behalf of the federal government. I'll be examining the circumstances surrounding the placement of an Indian child with a white family, and I'll be interviewing all relevant parties to ensure that federal policy is being properly implemented." A murmur ran through the crowd at Fleming's blunt language, and Jake stepped forward slightly. "Inspector, I think you'll find that the circumstances you're investigating represent exactly the kind of successful integration that federal policy claims to encourage. Daniel Clearwater is a healthy, happy, well-educated child who's thriving in a loving home with connections to both sides of his heritage." Fleming's response revealed the ideological rigidity that had made him so effective in previous assignments. "Mr. Patterson, successful integration requires complete assimilation into American civilization, not the maintenance of primitive customs that prevent proper development. Mixed arrangements of the type you describe actually hinder the process." They claimed to support. The words were calculated to provoke, and Fleming watched with satisfaction as several people in the crowd reacted with obvious anger. In his experience, emotional responses from Indian sympathizers usually revealed weaknesses that could be exploited during formal proceedings. But it was one of the Comanche women who responded, and her dignity in the face of Fleming's calculated insult caught him off guard. Singing Bird stepped forward with the same regal bearing she had shown during the confrontation with Agent Whitmore, addressing Fleming in English that was accented but grammatically perfect. "Inspector Fleming, I am Singing Bird, and I am Daniel's mother. You speak of primitive customs, but what could be more primitive than a system that destroys families in the name of helping children? What could be more civilized than raising a child with love, respect, and knowledge of his complete heritage?" Fleming had prepared for many possible challenges to his authority, but he had not expected to face an Indian woman who could articulate her position with the sophistication of an educated white person. His training had taught him to expect either hostile silence or emotional outbursts from Indian parents, not reasoned arguments that exposed the contradictions in federal policy. "Madam," Fleming replied, falling back on the formal authority that had served him in difficult situations, "your personal feelings, while understandable, cannot override the requirements of federal law. Indian children must be educated in facilities designed to prepare them for productive participation in American society." But before Singing Bird could respond, another voice cut through the tension with the authority of professional expertise. "Inspector Fleming, I'm Dr. William Longfellow, and I've been monitoring Daniel Clearwater's health and development since birth. Perhaps you'd like to review his medical records before making determinations about his welfare." Fleming turned to see a well-dressed man in his 40s whose mixed features suggested the kind of successful integration that federal policy claimed to promote. Dr. Longfellow's obvious prosperity and professional Standing created an immediate problem for Fleming's argument that mixed-race individuals could not succeed in white society. Dr. Longfellow. Fleming acknowledged cautiously, recognizing that attacking a respected medical professional would require more care than dismissing Indian parents. I'll certainly review any relevant documentation as part of my investigation. Dr. Longfellow's smile carried the confidence of someone who had spent years navigating the complexities of mixed-race identity in professional settings. Excellent. You'll find that Daniel shows every sign of normal, healthy development, with cognitive abilities that suggest exceptional intelligence. His social development has been enhanced, not hindered, by exposure to multiple cultural traditions. The doctor's clinical language made it difficult for Fleming to dismiss his observations without appearing anti-scientific, but it was Dr. Longfellow's next statement that created the real challenge. Inspector, I should mention that I've documented similar positive outcomes in several other mixed-race children throughout the region. If you're interested in a comprehensive evaluation of integration success, I'd be happy to provide comparative data. Fleming realized that he was facing a coordinated effort to present him with evidence that contradicted every assumption underlying his mission. Instead of isolated families who could be intimidated or ignored, he was confronting a network of successful mixed-race individuals who could demonstrate that federal policies were not only unnecessary but counterproductive. Dr. Longfellow, Fleming said carefully, while I appreciate your professional observations, medical development is only one aspect of proper assimilation. Cultural and moral development require structured environments that civilian arrangements cannot provide. It was Reverend Michael O'Sullivan who stepped forward to address this argument, his clerical collar giving him moral authority that Fleming could not easily dismiss. Inspector Fleming, I've had the privilege of observing the Clearwater family's spiritual development, and I can testify that young Daniel is being raised with strong moral principles and deep respect for both Christian values and the natural world. The Reverend's presence created another complication for Fleming's mission. Religious leaders were supposed to support government efforts to civilize Indian populations, not defend arrangements that maintained tribal connections. O'Sullivan's endorsement of the mixed cultural approach represented a crack in the institutional support that Fleming had always been able to count on. Reverend, Fleming replied, while I respect the Church's role in moral education, the federal government has specific responsibilities for Indian children that cannot be delegated to local arrangements, regardless of their apparent success. But, as Fleming looked around the crowd, he began to understand that his usual tactics would not work in this situation. Every argument he made was being countered by articulate, credible witnesses who had direct experience with the family he was supposed to investigate. Every assumption about Indian incapacity was being challenged by living examples of successful integration. Most troubling was the presence of Captain David Morrison, whose military uniform commanded respect even from federal investigators. Morrison had arrived the previous day and had spent hours with Martha and Daniel, documenting his son's development and preparing testimony that would be difficult for Fleming to dismiss. Inspector Fleming, Captain Morrison stepped forward with the bearing of an officer accustomed to being heard. I believe we should discuss the specific circumstances of this case before you proceed with your investigation. As Daniel's biological father, I have legal standing that may affect your conclusions. The revelation that Daniel's father was not only present, but was a respected military officer created immediate complications for Fleming's mission. Military personnel were supposed to support federal Indian policy, not challenge it, and Morrison's involvement suggested political complexities that Fleming had not been prepared to handle. Captain Morrison, Fleming acknowledged stiffly, I was not informed that paternal issues were involved in this case. That information will certainly need to be factored into my evaluation. But Morrison's next words revealed the trap that Jake Patterson had carefully constructed around Fleming's investigation. Inspector, I should inform you that Senator William Henderson has asked me to provide him with a detailed report on your methods and conclusions. The senator is particularly interested in how federal policies affect military families and mixed-race children. The mention of Senator Henderson's interest transformed Fleming's routine investigation into a political minefield. Henderson was not only powerful in Washington, but was known for his skepticism about Bureau of Indian Affairs policies. A negative report from him could destroy Fleming's career and his hopes for political advancement. Fleming found himself facing a situation that defied every technique he had developed for handling Indian affairs. Instead of isolated, powerless families, he was confronting a coalition of influential citizens who had prepared extensively for his arrival. Instead of being able to rely on bureaucratic authority and public indifference, he was operating under intense scrutiny from people whose opinions could affect his future. As the crowd began to disperse, and Fleming was escorted to his accommodations, he realized that the next few days would require all his skill and experience to navigate successfully. The Daniel Clearwater case had evolved from a simple policy enforcement matter into a test of federal authority that could have consequences extending far beyond one child's future. But Marcus Fleming had not built his career by backing down from difficult cases, and he was not prepared to start now. If Jake Patterson and his allies wanted a battle over federal Indian policy, Fleming was prepared to give them one. The question was whether his bureaucratic weapons would be sufficient to overcome the coalition of interests that had assembled to protect Daniel Clearwater. The real investigation was about to begin, and Fleming was determined to prove that federal authority could not be overridden by local sentiment, regardless of how well organized and influential that sentiment might be. The formal hearing that would determine Daniel Clearwater's fate took place in the largest room available in Clearwater Creek, the main hall of the Methodist Church, which had been transformed into a makeshift courtroom for the occasion. Inspector General Fleming had initially insisted on conducting private interviews, but the combination of media attention and political pressure had forced him to accept a public proceeding that would allow all interested parties to present their evidence. Fleming sat at a table positioned near the church's altar, flanked by his two deputy marshals and surrounded by stacks of federal regulations, precedent cases, and documentation that represented 15 years of successful Indian child removals. His confidence in the power of bureaucratic authority remained unshaken, despite the unexpected resistance he had encountered upon his arrival. Across from him, Jake Patterson had assembled what looked more like a legal defense team than a group of concerned citizens. Judge Thomas Hartwell sat ready to challenge any procedural irregularities, while Dr. William Longfellow had prepared medical and developmental evidence that would be difficult to dismiss. Captain Morrison wore his full dress uniform, emphasizing his military authority and his status as Daniel's biological father. But it was the presence of Martha Clearwater, holding 9-month-old Daniel in her arms, that created the most powerful visual argument for keeping the family together. The baby had grown noticeably in the months since Agent Whitmore's visit, and his obvious health and contentment provided living proof that his current arrangement was serving his needs effectively. Fleming opened the proceedings with a statement designed to establish federal authority as the paramount consideration in all decisions regarding Indian children. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here to determine whether the current placement of a mixed-race Indian child complies with federal policy designed to ensure proper assimilation and education. The federal government has a legal and moral obligation to protect Indian children from arrangements that might hinder their development into productive American citizens. Jake Patterson rose to respond, his massive frame commanding attention throughout the packed church hall. Inspector Fleming, we're here to determine what's in the best interests of a specific child, Daniel Clearwater, not to debate abstract policy. The evidence will show that Daniel is thriving in his current environment, and that removing him would cause tremendous harm to a child who has never known any other family. The first witness Fleming called was Agent Harrison Whitmore, who had traveled from his current posting to testify about the original circumstances that had led to the investigation. Fleming clearly expected Whitmore to provide testimony supporting federal intervention, but Jake's months of preparation had included extensive conversations with the agent who had first agreed to the compromise arrangement, Agent Whitmore. Fleming began, "Please describe the irregular situation you discovered at the Clearwater homestead and explain why federal intervention was necessary." Whitmore's response immediately revealed that Fleming's expectations would not be met. "Inspector Fleming, what I discovered was a well-cared-for child living with a devoted mother who had provided excellent care since his birth. The arrangement was irregular only in the sense that it challenged conventional assumptions about racial categories and family structures." Fleming's expression tightened as he realized that his own witness was undermining his case. "Agent Whitmore, surely you recognize that federal policy requires Indian children to be educated in appropriate facilities designed for their specific needs?" "Inspector, federal policy requires that Indian children receive education and care that prepares them for productive lives. In Daniel's case, that education and care were already being provided by his adoptive mother, supplemented by cultural instruction from his birth mother, and guaranteed by Mr. Patterson's financial support." Whitmore's testimony continued for nearly an hour, during which he methodically dismantled every argument Fleming had prepared. The agent described Daniel's obvious health and happiness, Martha's dedication and competence, and the community support that surrounded the family. Most damaging to Fleming's case was Whitmore's admission that removing Daniel would serve no practical purpose other than enforcing bureaucratic uniformity. Fleming's second witness was Dr. Marcus Weber, a government physician who had been brought from Washington specifically to challenge Dr. Longfellow's medical assessments. Dr. Weber had never examined Daniel personally, but he was prepared to testify about the general inadequacy of civilian medical care for Indian children and the superior facilities available at government institutions. However, Jake Patterson had anticipated this strategy and had prepared a devastating cross-examination that exposed the weaknesses in Dr. Weber's position. When Jake questioned the government physician about his specific experience with mixed-race children, Dr. Weber was forced to admit that his knowledge was based entirely on theoretical training rather than practical experience. Dr. Weber, Jake continued relentlessly, "Have you ever examined a child who has been raised in a mixed cultural environment like Daniel Clearwater?" "No, but my training in government Indian affairs has provided me with extensive knowledge of the challenges such arrangements create." "And what specific challenges has Daniel Clearwater experienced as a result of his mixed cultural upbringing?" Dr. Weber's pause revealed that he had no specific knowledge of Daniel's actual development. "The challenges may not be immediately apparent, but they will certainly manifest as the child grows older and attempts to integrate into civilized society." Jake's response was swift and decisive. "Dr. Weber, are you seriously asking this hearing to remove a healthy, happy child from a loving family based on problems that you admit have not occurred and may never occur?" The exchange effectively destroyed Dr. Weber's credibility and demonstrated the speculative nature of Fleming's arguments against Daniel's current placement. But it was the testimony of Daniel's advocates that truly transformed the hearing from a bureaucratic proceeding into a powerful demonstration of community support. Dr. William Longfellow presented comprehensive medical records showing that Daniel's physical and cognitive development exceeded normal benchmarks for children his age. The doctor's mixed-race heritage gave his testimony additional weight, as he could speak from personal experience about the challenges and advantages of growing up between two cultures. "Inspector Fleming," Dr. Longfellow testified, "I have had the privilege of observing Daniel's development since birth, and I can state categorically that he shows no signs of the confusion or developmental delays that government theories predict. for mixed-race children. On the contrary, his exposure to multiple cultural traditions appears to have enhanced his cognitive abilities and social awareness. Reverend O'Sullivan provided testimony about Daniel's moral and spiritual development, emphasizing the strong ethical foundation that Martha and Singing Bird had provided. The Reverend's endorsement of the family's approach to blending Christian and Comanche spiritual traditions challenged Fleming's assumption that Indian customs were inherently incompatible with civilized values, but it was Captain Morrison's testimony that created the most serious legal complications for Fleming's mission. As Daniel's biological father, Morrison had legal standing that could not be easily dismissed, and his military record gave him credibility that even federal investigators had to respect. Inspector Fleming, Morrison testified, as Daniel's father, I have carefully evaluated his current situation and concluded that he is receiving superior care and education. Martha Clearwater has been an exemplary mother, and Singing Bird has provided cultural education that will help Daniel understand and value both sides of his heritage. Morrison's voice carried the authority of command as he continued. More importantly, Daniel is surrounded by people who love him unconditionally and who are committed to his welfare rather than to abstract policy objectives. Removing him from this environment would be not only unnecessary but actively harmful to his development. Fleming attempted to challenge Morrison's testimony by questioning the propriety of his relationship with Singing Bird, but this line of attack backfired when Morrison responded with dignity and honesty about the genuine affection that had developed between them despite the cultural barriers that separated their worlds. Inspector Fleming, my relationship with Singing Bird began during a period when both of us were stationed near Fort Richardson for different reasons. What developed between us was based on mutual respect and genuine affection, not the casual exploitation that you seem to be implying. Morrison's frank acknowledgement of his relationship with Singing Bird, combined with his obvious pride in Daniel, created a powerful narrative of love transcending racial boundaries that resonated throughout the packed church hall. But it was Singing Bird's own testimony that provided the most compelling argument for maintaining Daniel's current placement. Speaking in clear, precise English that demonstrated her intelligence and education, she addressed Fleming with a dignity that had impressed everyone who had encountered her. Inspector Fleming, you have spoken much about assimilation and civilization, but I ask you to consider what those words truly mean. Is it civilized to tear a baby from the arms of the only mother he has ever known? Is it assimilation to teach a child that he must choose between two halves of himself? Singing Bird's voice grew stronger as she continued. My son is learning to read in English and to count in Comanche. He is learning Christian prayers and traditional songs. He is growing up surrounded by people who value both his father's heritage and mine. How is this not the best possible preparation for living in a world where different peoples must learn to coexist? Her final words carried the weight of maternal authority that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. Inspector Fleming, if you take my son from us, you will not be saving him from confusion or helping him to assimilate. You will be teaching him that love is less important than bureaucratic rules, and that the government's opinion matters more than the welfare of actual children. Fleming's response revealed the ideological rigidity that had made him effective in previous assignments but was proving counterproductive in this more complex situation. Mrs. Singing Bird, individual cases cannot be allowed to override federal policy that has been developed for the benefit of all Indian children. Your personal attachment to this child, while understandable, cannot supersede the government's responsibility for his proper development. But Fleming's abstract arguments about policy and procedure seemed increasingly hollow when measured against the concrete evidence of Daniel's thriving development and the obvious love that surrounded him. The packed church hall could see the contrast between bureaucratic theory and human reality, and their sympathies were clearly with the family that had created such a successful mixed Cultural environment. The turning point in the hearing came when Fleming made a tactical error that revealed the true nature of his mission. Frustrated by the consistent challenges to his authority and the growing evidence supporting Daniel's current placement, Fleming abandoned his pretense of concern for the child's welfare and showed his true motivations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Fleming declared with rising anger, "this hearing is not about one child's happiness or one family's preferences. It is about whether the federal government has the authority to implement policies designed to solve the Indian problem once and for all. If we allow exceptions based on individual circumstances, the entire system of Indian management becomes meaningless." The phrase "Indian problem" sent a shock through the assembled crowd, revealing Fleming's view of Daniel not as a child deserving protection, but as part of a racial category that needed to be eliminated through forced assimilation. Jake Patterson immediately seized on this revealing slip. "Inspector Fleming, did you just refer to a 9-month-old baby as part of an Indian problem that needs to be solved?" Fleming realized his mistake immediately, but the damage was done. His own words had exposed the dehumanizing assumptions underlying his mission, transforming him from a concerned federal official into a representative of policies that valued bureaucratic efficiency over human welfare. The hearing that Fleming had expected to be a routine enforcement of federal authority had become a public demonstration of the cruelty and arbitrariness of Indian policies. Instead of proving federal competence, the investigation had revealed the superiority of love-based family arrangements over institutional solutions. As the formal testimony concluded and Fleming prepared to announce his decision, everyone in the church hall understood that they had witnessed more than a custody hearing. They had seen a fundamental conflict between two different visions of American society, one based on racial categories and government control, and another based on individual merit and family bonds that transcended artificial boundaries. Fate of Daniel Clearwater would be decided not just by bureaucratic regulations, but by Fleming's willingness to choose humanity over ideology in a situation where the evidence overwhelmingly supported the power of love over the logic of separation. Inspector General Marcus Fleming sat alone in his hotel room that evening, staring at the blank official report that would determine not only Daniel Clearwater's future, but his own career trajectory. The hearing had gone worse than his most pessimistic projections, and every argument he had prepared had been systematically demolished by witnesses whose credibility he could not challenge and evidence he could not refute. For the first time in 15 years of federal service, Fleming found himself facing a situation where enforcing policy would clearly cause more harm than good, where bureaucratic authority conflicted directly with human welfare, and where his usual tactics of intimidation and procedural manipulation had proven completely ineffective. The political ramifications of his decision were staggering. Senator Henderson's office had made it clear that they were monitoring the case closely, and several other powerful politicians had expressed interest in how federal Indian policy was being implemented in Texas. A decision that appeared arbitrary or cruel would attract the kind of negative attention that could destroy careers and trigger congressional investigations. But more troubling to Fleming than the political consequences was the growing realization that his fundamental assumptions about Indian families and mixed-race children might be wrong. Daniel Clearwater was living proof that children could thrive in environments that federal policy claimed were harmful, and the Clearwater family demonstrated that love and commitment could overcome the barriers that government theories insisted were insurmountable. Fleming's personal crisis was interrupted by a knock on his door. He opened it to find Jake Patterson, whose massive frame filled the doorway and whose expression carried none of the diplomatic courtesy he had shown during the public hearing. "Inspector Fleming," Jake said quietly, "I think it's time we had a private conversation about Daniel's future." Fleming stepped aside to allow Jake into the room, recognizing that whatever happened next would likely determine the final outcome of his investigation. The two men sat across from each other at the small table that Fleming had been using as a desk, and for a moment neither spoke. "Mr. Patterson," Fleming said finally, "I assume you're here to make some kind of final appeal on behalf of the Clearwater family." Jake's response surprised him. "Actually, Inspector, I'm here to make you an offer that could solve both of our problems." Fleming raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "What kind of offer?" "The kind that allows you to return to Washington with a success story instead of a failure," Jake replied. "You came here to prove that federal Indian policy works, and I'm prepared to help you do exactly that." Jake leaned forward, his voice taking on the persuasive tone that had made him successful in countless business negotiations. "Inspector, what if I told you that instead of fighting federal policy, I was prepared to work with it? What if the Daniel Clearwater case became a model for how mixed-race children could be successfully integrated into American society through cooperation between federal authorities and local communities?" Fleming was intrigued but skeptical. "Mr. Patterson, federal policy requires specific procedures and institutional frameworks. I can't simply ignore regulations because local arrangements appear to be working." "Who's asking you to ignore regulations?" Jake countered. "I'm asking you to expand them. Create a new category of placement for mixed-race children who are already thriving in stable family environments. Establish monitoring procedures that ensure compliance with federal educational and cultural standards while allowing successful arrangements to continue." The proposal was brilliant in its simplicity, offering Fleming a way to transform potential defeat into innovative policy development. Instead of being the inspector who was defeated by local resistance, he could become the federal official who had developed new approaches to Indian child welfare that balanced government oversight with family stability. The documentation would be extensive, Jake continued. Regular reports on Daniel's educational progress, medical evaluations, cultural development assessments, and community integration measures. You'd have more oversight of this child than you would if you were in a government institution, but it would be oversight that supported success rather than enforcing failure. Fleming found himself genuinely considering the proposal, recognizing that it offered benefits that went far beyond the immediate case. "Mr. Patterson, even if I were inclined to consider such an arrangement, I would need guarantees that go beyond your personal commitments." "Done," Jake replied immediately. "Judge Hartwell has agreed to establish formal legal guardianship procedures that would give the court ongoing jurisdiction over Daniel's welfare. Dr. Longfellow will provide quarterly medical and developmental assessments. Captain Morrison will submit annual reports on Daniel's progress to military authorities, and Reverend O'Sullivan will monitor his moral and spiritual development." The comprehensiveness of Jake's proposal revealed months of careful planning, and Fleming began to understand that he was being offered not just a compromise, but a complete alternative framework for handling mixed-race children. And if this arrangement fails? If Daniel's development suffers, or if problems emerge that require federal intervention, then you step in immediately with full federal authority, Jake said simply. "But Inspector, if this arrangement succeeds, if Daniel grows up to be educated, productive, and proud of both sides of his heritage, then you'll have created a model that could transform federal Indian policy throughout the country." Fleming spent the next hour examining the details of Jake's proposal, testing every aspect for potential weaknesses or political vulnerabilities. But the more he studied the arrangement, the more he realized that it offered everything federal policy claimed to want: successful assimilation, proper education, cultural development, and community integration, while avoiding the family destruction and child trauma that characterized most government interventions. More importantly, the proposal offered Fleming something his career had been lacking: the chance to be remembered for creating solutions rather than simply enforcing problems. Instead of being another bureaucrat who had separated families in the name of abstract policy, He could become the official who had found ways to achieve policy goals while preserving family bonds. The next morning, Fleming announced his decision to a packed church hall that had been transformed once again into a public forum. Representatives from newspapers throughout Texas were present, along with federal officials who had traveled from Austin and San Antonio to observe the conclusion of the investigation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Fleming began, his voice carrying none of the rigid authority that had characterized his earlier statements. "After conducting a thorough investigation into the placement of Daniel Clearwater, I have concluded that the current arrangement serves both the child's individual needs and the broader goals of federal Indian policy." A murmur of surprise and relief ran through the assembled crowd, but Fleming continued before anyone could interrupt. "However, this case has also revealed the need for new approaches to mixed-race children who are already thriving in stable family environments. Therefore, I am recommending the establishment of a pilot program that would allow successful placements to continue under enhanced federal monitoring and support." Fleming's announcement transformed what could have been a bureaucratic defeat into a policy innovation that served everyone's interests. Daniel would remain with Martha and maintain his connections to Singing Bird and the Comanche women who loved him. The federal government would maintain oversight and documentation that satisfied regulatory requirements, and Fleming would return to Washington with a success story that could advance his career while improving the lives of mixed-race children throughout the territory. But it was Fleming's final statement that revealed how profoundly the experience had changed his understanding of his own mission. "The Daniel Clearwater case has taught me that effective federal policy must be based on actual outcomes rather than theoretical assumptions. When we find arrangements that are producing the results we want, educated, healthy, well-adjusted children who are prepared to contribute to American society, our job should be to support and strengthen those arrangements, not destroy them in the name of bureaucratic uniformity." The response from the crowd was overwhelming, but it was the reaction of the Clearwater family that provided the most powerful testament to the wisdom of Fleming's decision. Martha held Daniel close, tears streaming down her face as she realized that her son would not be torn from the only family he had ever known. Singing Bird and the other Comanche women embraced each other with the quiet joy of people who had just witnessed a miracle they had not dared to hope for. Jake Patterson felt a satisfaction deeper than any business success he had ever achieved. For the first time since Sarah Ridge's death 15 years earlier, he had been able to use his wealth and influence to prevent a government-sanctioned tragedy. More importantly, he had helped create a precedent that might protect other mixed-race families from the arbitrary cruelty of policies that valued bureaucratic consistency over human welfare. Captain Morrison's relief was evident as he realized that his son would grow up knowing both sides of his heritage, surrounded by people who valued his complete identity rather than demanding that he choose between two halves of himself. The guilt that had plagued him since running Bear's death began to lift as he understood that Daniel's future would honor rather than deny the complex circumstances of his birth. The immediate celebration was joyous, but the long-term implications of Fleming's decision extended far beyond one family's happiness. Word of the Daniel Clearwater case spread rapidly throughout the territory, inspiring other mixed-race families to resist separation and demand recognition of successful integration arrangements that were already working. Within 2 years, Fleming's pilot program had been adopted as official policy in 3 territories, and Congress was considering legislation that would establish similar protections for mixed-race children throughout the country. The Inspector General who had arrived in Texas to enforce rigid assimilation policies had become the architect of reforms that balanced federal oversight with family preservation. Daniel Clearwater grew up to become everything that Jake Patterson's investment had promised. Educated in both English and Comanche, comfortable in both white and Indian communities, he eventually attended university on a scholarship that Jake had established for mixed-race students. His success became a powerful argument for policies that celebrated rather than suppressed cultural diversity. But more importantly, Daniel grew up knowing that he was loved unconditionally by people who had fought to keep him when it would have been easier to surrender him to government authority. The story of how 5 Comanche women had begged a giant rancher to protect their child, and how that rancher had said, "Over my dead body," to federal officials, became part of Daniel's identity and inspired his own lifelong commitment to protecting vulnerable families. Martha Clearwater continued to serve as Daniel's mother while maintaining close relationships with Singing Bird and the other Comanche women who had been part of his extended family. The arrangement that federal policy had claimed was impossible became a model of how love could transcend racial boundaries and create families based on choice rather than biology alone. Singing Bird eventually married Captain Morrison in a ceremony that honored both Christian and Comanche traditions, creating a legal family structure that legitimized their relationship while preserving the cultural connections that had made Daniel's upbringing so rich and successful. Together, they had 3 more children who grew up as Daniel's siblings, creating a mixed-race family that challenged every assumption about cultural incompatibility. Jake Patterson used his success in the Daniel Clearwater case to establish a foundation that provided legal and financial support for mixed-race families throughout the West. The foundation helped hundreds of families resist separation while providing education and resources that enabled their children to succeed in both white and Indian communities. Most importantly, Jake's intervention in Daniel's case had provided him with something he had thought was lost forever: the ability to protect people he cared about from the arbitrary cruelty of systems that confused legal authority with moral legitimacy. The powerless young farmer who had watched Sarah Ridge disappear into government custody had become a man whose wealth and influence could actually change outcomes for vulnerable families. The story of Daniel Clearwater became legendary throughout Texas and beyond, told and retold as an example of how individual courage and community solidarity could overcome institutional prejudice and bureaucratic indifference. It was a story about the power of love to transcend racial boundaries, the importance of fighting for principles even when victory seemed impossible, and the way that one person's determination to do right could inspire others to join the cause of justice. But at its heart, it remained the story of a baby whose life had been saved by 5 Comanche women who refused to accept that government policy was more important than a child's welfare, and a giant rancher who proved that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is simply refusing to let it happen. Years later, when Daniel Clearwater had become a successful lawyer and advocate for Indian rights, he would tell the story of his own childhood to audiences throughout the country. He would speak of the courage of women who had risked everything to protect him, the generosity of a rancher who had used his wealth to ensure that love triumphed over law, and the federal inspector who had chosen humanity over ideology when the moment of decision arrived. But Daniel always ended his speeches with the same observation: the most important lesson of my childhood was not that individual cases can overcome bad policy, but that good policy must be based on what actually works for real children and real families. When we create systems that serve abstract principles rather than human welfare, we create systems that deserve to be challenged and changed. The legacy of the Daniel Clearwater case lived on in the hundreds of mixed-race children who grew up in loving families because precedents had been established that valued success over conformity, love over law, and the welfare of actual children over the theoretical concerns of distant bureaucrats. It was a legacy written in the lives of people who had been allowed to become their full selves rather than forced to choose between 2 halves of their identity. And in a small cemetery in Texas, under a headstone that read, "Sarah Ridge Beloved. Daughter, sister, and friend," wildflowers grew each spring, planted by someone who had never forgotten the woman whose death had inspired a lifetime of fighting for justice. The flowers were a reminder that love endures beyond loss, that tragedy can inspire triumph, and that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is ensuring that it never happens again to anyone else. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.